Welcome back. In the last video I talked about the plans and designs for my workshop build. In this one we're starting the build and getting the foundations done. I'll go over the design on the foundations, the work you would need to do, and in the end the costs involved. My goal is to DIY as much of the build as possible, but I have to admit for the foundations I got someone in and there's two reasons for that. The first is digging out the area really would have needed a mini digger. I could have hired one, but having never used one before and not knowing how long it would take for me to get the hang of it, I just thought it better to get someone in. The second is the concrete pour. I'm sure with a few extra hands to barrow the concrete from the mixer to the site it would have been fine, but once again, getting someone in meant they would already know what they're doing and do a much better and efficient job at levelling and getting a good finish. So let's go over the designs and go through the build process. We start by digging down 225mm with a mini digger. Big thanks to Sean and Scott from SS Groundworks, who I got in to get the job done. Sean got to work digging as Scott alternated wheelbarrows taking the soil to the front of the house. Once they got close to the target depth, they set up a level string line near the edge. They could then measure from the string line at different points to see how far they were and which areas needed digging out a bit more. The height of the string line doesn't really matter as long as it's level and you can figure out the height it is from ground level. The rest is just a bit of math to account for how far the string line is from ground level. All the waste soil was dumped out front to be taken away a few hours later by a grab-and-go truck, which also delivered the hardcore. If you're producing large volumes of waste over a short period of time like we are digging out the soil in one morning, then the grab-and-go truck can be a cheaper alternative to a skip. Next is the hardcore. We're after 100mm of compacted hardcore to put down in the area that was dug out. It's brought in and spread across the area, then compacted down. The level string line was used once again to make sure it was level and show where more or less hardcore was needed. Doing this is best done in layers, so this process was repeated twice until we got to the 100mm. The designs next call for roughly 25mm of soft sand. This is so when the DPM goes down later, there's less risk of sharp rocks in the hardcore puncturing it. However, we skipped this and just carefully went over the compacted hardcore, removing or compacting down further any troublesome looking stones. After this, the shuttering goes up. This is to hold in the concrete once it's poured. We used 100mm high rough sawn timber, pegged in place with 2x2s. This part is essential to get level, but with a pretty level hardcore base to work from, it was pretty straightforward to achieve. We also had to make sure that the shuttering was square. For this, Sean grabbed a tape measure and used the 3-4-5 rule on each of the corners. You'll notice the hardcore extends out past where the concrete slab will be, and we end up with a roughly 50cm border around the whole area. This is so when the shuttering is removed, there's a continuous hardcore base past the edges of the slab. If not, the hardcore could fall away, leaving a gap under the concrete slab's edges. Next, the DPM is laid within the shuttering. The concrete will be poured over this and the DPM will wrap up the side and partially over the top, so we need to leave some extra DPM overhang at the edges to play with. DPM generally comes in 4 m wide rolls, so having a 3.5 m base is probably the most I would go for without either overlapping DPM joined with some DPM tape or trying to find wider rolls. This is so we have enough to wrap up the foundations under the brick dwarf wall and a little up the side to join it to the DBC later. Folding the stuff at the corner is a bit tricky too. It's basically thick plastic sheet, so quite a bit of finessing is needed. Later I'll cut, fold and join with DPM tape at the corners so the brick dwarf wall has a good flat surface to be built on. The next day the reinforcement mesh was put in. You can buy concrete risers for this, but we had some old paving slabs laying around and just broke them up to make some free risers. Finally, the concrete was poured. For each of these layers, we also made sure the conduit for the electrics came through and would end up coming up in one of the corners of the concrete slab. This then ends up being on what will be the inside of the workshop. The concrete is then tapped down first with a bit of wood and then again with a spirit level. The result is a smooth and level surface that's then left to set. Having Sean there to do this makes it look easy and we got a really satisfying result. When finished, the top of the slab ends up at ground level. That 50cm border will later be filled with gravel to act as a French drain so any water doesn't make it into the workshop. I'll also stick some weed barrier down in this border before adding the gravel to stop any unwanted growth. The benefit of having a slab at ground level is it maximises the internal ceiling height I can get while still being under the 2.5 metre permitted development height. I could have opted for a timber raised floor on plinth foundations, but this would have eaten up quite a bit of height that would have been taken away from the internal ceiling height. Also, without good protection, the space under a raised floor could quickly become a home for unwanted pests. There are some plus sides to a raised timber floor though. It's cheaper, easier to do yourself, and you can add insulation between the joists of the floor. We'll chat a bit more on insulation in another video, but in summary, for my design, the floor insulation will be sitting on top of the concrete slab. 3 days later, it was fully set, and in the end, it took the guys a day and a morning to finish. A regret I have though is not rounding over the top of the concrete corners a little as it was starting to set. This would have made folding over the DPM a little easier and resulted in less sharp corners on that top edge. Instead, I chipped away most of the worst offenders a little before folding the DPM over. So in the end, this cost me £2,100. If you're DIYing with a few friends, you could get this cheaper, but would have to pay for a mini digger hire, waste removal, hardcore, shuttering, DPM, reinforcement mesh, risers, concrete, and any tools such as string lines, wheelbarrows, or an impact driver. For me now, that makes the total running cost thus far £2,622. To finish off, I went around and tidied up the DPM, cutting and folding it over the top, ready for the dwarf wall. And that's what I'll be covering in the next video.